Thank you so much for having me, and I'm really looking forward to this session to show you some of the stuff that we've had my colleagues talk about in the past couple of sessions, and I'll make it a little bit personal, right? Because I live in sunny Belgium, at least today it is, and that means that it has been quite a journey for me to work with Neo4j, and I've actually started my journey with what I call the beer graph, right? So the beer graph is where this all where this all kind of started for me in 2012, 2013, which is when I decided to kind of get my hands dirty with Neo4j and to look at a data set. That is very dear to my heart, which is a Wikipedia page. You can see it at the bottom of the screen here, and obviously we'll share it with all of the Belgian beers, right? This is quite a long Wikipedia page. There's a couple of thousand beers on there. And I decided, you know what, if I want to get to know Neo4j, this was, back in the 1.7 days, I believe it was. But it still applies to the 3.x series and the 4.x series. I'm going to import this into Neo4j, right? So that's what I did. I converted it into a Google Sheet, and then I imported that Google Sheet with a very simple cipher statement into a Neo4j instance, right? And the import was super simple. Once I kind of got a hold of it, and Michael Hunger was kind enough to help me a couple of times, but I got around to it and I imported it into Neo4j. And I'd like to kind of show that part to you, and then afterwards I'll show you what 4.0 brings to the table and how we've actually added some really interesting functionalities that are very relevant to even beer data sets like this one, right? So I'm going to show you here which 3.5 database, right, which I think is 3.5.16 latest version, which I have already done the import in just to familiarize you with what I've been doing, right? It's got the breweries in there, right? It's got the beer types in there. It's got the beer brands in there, and it's got the alcohol percentages in there, and that's basically the data set that I have in here. And as I said, I wanted to talk to you about some beer epiphanies, right? Well, let me show you that, right? When I first started to play around with this, the first thing I did obviously was to look up one of my favorite beers, which is Orval. I don't know if you know Orval. It's a fine Belgian beer. It's brewed by the Abbey of Notre Dame d'Orval in the Ardennes, beautiful area. And it's a Trappist beer, right? A Trappist beer. I'm sure you're familiar with Trappist beers. But this one is a little bit peculiar because it's 6.2% alcohol. 6.2% alcohol for a Trappist beer is quite light. This is a special beer in some ways because it's also a beer that's actually not that sweet. It's a kind of a sour beer. And my first epiphany was when I started to click around here. Obviously, I look at the other Trappist beers over here, right? And I started to say, oh, hey, what other percentage beers have the same alcohol percentage? And I see this guy here in the middle, right? Right. Orval's over here. West Vleteren 6 is over there. And for those of you that are into their beers, you will find that West Vleteren is super famous, right? It's a super exclusive Trappist beer brewed by the St. Sixtus Abbey, right? And the St. Sixtus Abbey is one of those beer abbeys that does not actually commercialize their beers. They only allow you to buy them from them when you drive there, when you call their beer phone. And of course, I'm stupid enough to have done that, right? And I've ordered the 8, I have ordered the blonde ones, I have ordered the 12, but I have never, ever, ever heard about the West Vleteren Zes, the 6, right? So this was my first epiphany. Wow, this is great. I'm learning something new about beers here. The graph is obviously recommending things to me, and I need to go and taste this beer. And I'm not doing that anytime soon. right? So that was my first epiphany, right? And let me show you the second one that's actually even more interesting. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of pathfinding, right? Which is a fantastic use case for Neo4j and graph databases. It's to find the links between two things, right? I don't know what those links might be. I don't have, hypotheses about these even, but if I want to find out the link between, let's say, Mossack Fonseca in Panama and the Kremlin in Moscow, I can just say, okay, find me all of those paths, and the graph will start talking to me, right? I can do the same thing with beers. I can say, okay, I like Orval here at the top. I like Duvel, right? And mind you, if you know your beers again, Orval and Duvel are very different beers, right? Duvel is kind of sweet. It's a very strong beer, 8.5%. Orval is quite sour, 6.2%. They're quite different from each other. But by running this query here at the top, I can see that there's actually a very, very short link between these two beers, right? I've got 6.2% alcohol for Orval, high yeast for Duvel, and there's these two beers here in the middle that I really should be drinking right now, right? So, and guess what? I've actually tried to taste these beers here in the middle. I didn't know of them before, and they're fantastic. Exactly what I want, right? So just by structuring the beer data as a graph, I'm immediately finding out new information. I'm immediately getting new insights. But let's see how this now translates into something even more interesting with the 4.0 capabilities. To do that, I'm going to go to my Neo4j desktop, and I'm going to stop my 3.5 installation, and I'm going to start my 4.0 installation, right? And in the meanwhile, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what happens with 4.0, right? With 4.0, we're literally adding 4 big new categories of functionality, right? First of all, the unlimited scale capability with Fabric, right? Ivan has already talked about that. Michael has already mentioned it, its importance for machine learning and stuff like that. We're making it much more easy for developers to integrate and work with Neo4j by giving it reactive capabilities. And then the bottom ones, I'm going to try and show you now. We're going to give this multi-tenancy capability to the new product. And we're also adding this really fine-grained graph security, right? So this is what I want to show you. Let's see if the 4.0 graph is running. Yes, it is, right? So now I've got a 4.0 database. I'm going to launch my browser, right? And I'm going to try and see if I can make the world a safer place by first of all creating a beer graph database, but also on 4.0, but by securing it also, right? So here we are, right? So we've got 4.0 running, and 4.0 has multiple databases already running. There's a system graph, which is something very specific. There's a default graph called Neo4j. There's a fraud graph. There's a Northwind graph, and the movie graph that are already running. Now, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to create my beer graph, right? Simple thing to do, right? I'm going to use the system database and create the beer graph, right? Right, job done. Right now, in order to prepare the import of the beers, right, because I'm going to start from scratch here, guys. This is a live demo, right? I need to add some indexes, right? Here we go, right? And then I can actually run the import, right? This is a cipher statement that I showed you earlier very quickly. Starting from a CSV file, I'm not starting from a Google Doc, I'm starting from a CSV file here. I'm importing all the different beers into my local database here, into my 4.0 database, right? As you can tell, a few seconds later, I've got 2,952 labels added, everything's done. And now if I actually switch to the beer graph, I should be able to see the alcohol percentages, right? Yep, everything's here, right? So I've got my beer graph. Fantastic, job well done. Right, now let's get into something a little bit more sophisticated, right? Because what I'd like to do, and this is my working hypothesis here in this short demo. I need to add an index, but that's a couple of milliseconds. What I'd like to do now is actually I'd like to secure the beer graph, because you know what? I don't want any of my kids to know anything about alcohol. Sounds like a Belgian thing to do, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a specific user. I'm going to call that user's child reader, right? And that child reader should not have any access to alcohol percentages, right? Obviously, this is a very hypothetical example, but that's what we're doing, right? So I've created the child reader. Now, the way the security model works in Neo4j 4.0 is that you work with a role-based access control system, right? So in order to secure my graph, my alcohol percentages, I'm going to create a role, right? The child reader role, right? That will protect my children from having any kind of exposure to alcohol percentages, right? So job done. I've created that role now as well, right? Now what I want to do is I want to put the child reader, right, into the child reader role, right? Here we go, right? And now I want to start adding some restrictions, right? The first kind of restriction that I want to impose is I want to deny my children the possibility of reading the alcohol percentage properties, right? So I've got alcohol percentage nodes in my graph, right? In my beer graph, right? And I want to deny the read of the value property on those alcohol percentage nodes to the child reader role, right? So if I do that, right, then if I now log into my Neo4j database as a child reader, I should not be able to see the properties anymore. Let's do that. Server disconnect. This is where my typing skills really help me. Adding in, I'm going to log in as a child reader, right? And now if I just of course, now I first need to change to the beer graph database, right? And I'm going to look for Orval again. Yep, I'm a child and I can still see what Orval is, but hey, there's something changed here. I can't see the alcohol percentage anymore, right? Because I'm logged in as a child, right? As an admin or as a normal user, as an adult user, I would still see this, but as a child, I can't see this anymore, right? Same thing with the pathfinding queries, right? I can still see the pattern, right? I can see that Orval is connected to Duvel through an alcohol percentage, but you know, my parents have made sure that I cannot see alcohol percentages anymore, right? That's the first restriction. Now let's do another one, a more interesting one. I'm going to log back in as an admin, right? And here we go. I'm going to add another restriction, right? So I'm going to switch to my system database, right? And I'm going to add another restriction, right? Specifically, the restriction that I want to put in there is I want to deny the right to traverse the graph, right? This is something I think is extremely innovative. You know, we are doing something here that I haven't seen any other database vendor do. What we're doing here is we're allowing you to specify that the child reader, right, who is in the child reader role, right, can no longer traverse the graph, right, through the relationship called has alcohol percentage, right? So a beer brand has an alcohol percentage, right? You can see this if I switch to the beer graph here, right, and I just quickly run this pathfinding query, you see that, you know, the beer here, Orval, has an alcohol percentage, right, of 6.2, right? That's the way they are connected to each other. Now, I want to deny children from doing that. I don't want them to be able to traverse that relationship, right? If I do that, then obviously all of my traversal queries will look pretty much different, right? So if I do that, right, I run this update, I now if I see that this has now been put in place. Oh, my machine is starting to be a little bit slow. I'm hoping this is not a big deal, right? You will see that there is a restriction, a denial of, here we go, right? You cannot traverse the alcohol percentage, right, to the child reader role, right? So this is now in place, right? So if I now disconnect, right, and reconnect as a, wait a minute, what have I done? Server disconnect, not system Rik, right? And I log back in as a child, right? And I now switch back to my beer graph database and run that original traversal query, right? So this pathfinding query that we have here, right? Hopefully you will see something completely different. Yes, it worked, right? Always wary if I've done something wrong here, but you can see Orval here. You know, in my previous examples, it was only like 3 hops away from Duvel, right? On the other side over here. Now, because it was going through the has alcohol percentage relationship, now not only is the child not able to read the property anymore, we cannot traverse it anymore, right? So now all of a sudden I can't even see those relationships anymore, right? And so the traversal, the path between Duvel and Orval has critically changed here. Right, so this is how this works. It's actually a really cool system and very easy to use, even for a lost salesperson like myself. So I encourage you to take a look at it. It's super fun to play around with, right? So that's basically the short story that I wanted to tell you, right? You can explore this beer graph yourself. You can add it as a new database, right? You can set it up and import the data into it, and you can protect your children from the big bad beer, right? By adding a child reader, putting them in a child reader role, assigning the privileges, and then exploring the data. You can see this on many other places. I've actually blogged about this. I've created some demos for this as well, and hopefully that will be fun for you to watch at a later time as well.